The heavy iron-rimmed wheels of the final wagon carved a deep, unfeeling trench into the arid earth, leaving Matilda choking on the bitter dust of her own abandonment. She did not scream for them to stop. She merely stood like a solitary monument of flesh and bone against the dying amber light of the prairie, watching the only people she knew disappear over the western ridge. They had cast her out not for cruelty of heart, but for the unforgivable crime of her towering size. The massive, heavy muscles that stretched the seams of her faded red dress unnerved their delicate sensibilities. Every time she lifted a broken wagon axle or carried a sick ox across a river, their fearful whispers grew louder. Now she was completely alone, abandoned to the coming dark. The wilderness was vast, and the plunging temperature of the evening promised a swift and brutal fate. A woman left behind in this desolate valley was a woman condemned to perish. But what the cowardly wagon master believed would be her lonely end was actually the beginning of something profoundly beautiful. Would you risk opening your home to someone the rest of the world had discarded? Stay until the end of this tale to witness a truly unexpected harvest of the heart. Like and comment where you are watching from to see how far this story travels. Matilda tightened her grip on her small, woven satchel. Her massive biceps flexed beneath the torn sleeves of her dress. She possessed the physical power of any two frontier laborers, yet her chest ached with an agonizing, quiet grief. She had spent her entire life trying to shrink, trying to apologize for the vast space her towering frame occupied. Now, the sprawling emptiness of the frontier threatened to swallow her whole. The chilling wind whipped her long, tangled blonde hair across her strong, resolute face. She took a deep, trembling breath, scanning the horizon for any form of shelter, knowing the prairie wolves would soon begin their nightly hunt. A rhythmic thud echoed against the hard soil. Matilda turned her broad shoulders. Through the settling dust of the trail, a massive silhouette emerged. He rode a heavy-footed draft horse, a beast perfectly suited for a man of his immense proportions. Gideon sat tall in the saddle. His broad shoulders and powerful frame blocked out the last rays of the sinking sun. He wore a weathered leather vest and a heavy canvas coat covered in the pale dust of the trail. The brim of his battered hat cast a deep shadow over his sun-bronzed skin and thick, rugged beard. He pulled back on the leather reins. The large horse snorted, stamping its heavy hooves into the dirt just a few yards from where Matilda stood. Most men flinched when they first truly looked at her. They would take a single step back, their eyes wide with poorly concealed intimidation or mocking disgust. Gideon did neither. His sharp, observant eyes swept over the deep wagon tracks leading westward, then settled quietly upon her formidable muscular figure. He noted the heavy leather boots coated in prairie mud, the thick, powerful thighs visible beneath her dusty skirt, and the undeniable exhaustion etched into the corners of her soft, feminine eyes. He saw the way she braced her feet, preparing for a fight she did not want. He did not reach for the rifle slung across his saddle. He simply rested his large, calloused hands on the saddle horn. The wagon master made a grave error, leaving his strongest hand behind. The deep resonance of his voice vibrated through the quiet evening air. Matilda stiffened. She planted her heavy boots firmly into the dirt, bracing herself for ridicule. "I am not looking for charity from a stranger." Her voice trembled with defensive pride, though her stomach hollowed with intense hunger. Gideon studied the fierce, unbroken dignity shining in her eyes. He recognized the heavy armor of a soul accustomed to painful rejection. He knew that pushing her would only cause her to retreat further into the dangerous wilderness. Instead of demanding answers, he simply offered peace. "It is Sunday evening." Gideon tipped the brim of his hat backward, revealing eyes that held an ocean of quiet sorrow and steady honor. "My cabin sits 2 miles up the northern ridge. I'm stewing a large cut of beef with winter carrots. It is far too much food for one man." Matilda stared at him, bewildered by the calm, unassuming nature of his words. "I am not asking for your life story," he continued gently, nodding toward the darkening sky. I'm only asking if you will join a lonely cattle foreman for a hot meal before the frost sets in." The wind howled across the barren plains, biting through the thin fabric of her dress. Matilda looked toward the treacherous, darkening horizon, then back to the imposing, silent protector waiting patiently atop his horse. His invitation carried no conditions, no hidden mockery, and no fear of her formidable size. Yet the sting of her recent betrayal throbbed fiercely in her chest. The shadows stretched longer across the valley floor. The cold night was rapidly descending. Will Matilda risk trusting this massive, silent stranger and step into his isolated home, or will the fresh trauma of her brutal betrayal force her to take her chances in the freezing, dangerous wild? The bitter wind whipped across the barren valley, slicing through the thin cotton of her dress and deciding her fate. Matilda looked up at the towering man sitting atop his heavy draft horse. She gave a single, resolute nod. Gideon did not smile, but a profound softness settled into the weathered creases around his sharp eyes. He turned his horse gently, setting a slow, deliberate pace that allowed her to walk beside him without straining her exhausted, powerful legs. The journey up the northern ridge was cast in deep purple twilight. The silence between them was not the harsh, judging silence she had known in the wagon camp. It was a thick, protective quiet, a shelter woven from the shared understanding of hardship. When the silhouette of the cabin finally emerged from the darkness, a golden, inviting light spilled from the square windows. The structure was built of thick, rough-hewn timber, sitting sturdy and unyielding against the wild frontier. Gideon pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping aside to allow her to enter first. Heat radiated from a massive stone hearth, instantly wrapping around her shivering muscular frame. The air was thick with the rich, savory aroma of roasted beef, wild thyme, and simmering root vegetables. Matilda stood awkwardly near the entrance. Her broad shoulders brushed the doorframe, a constant reminder of the immense space she occupied in the world. Yet as she looked around the solitary cabin, a strange sense of comfort washed over her. Everything inside this home was built on a massive scale. The iron cooking pots were huge, the ceiling beams were unusually high, and the thick oak table was braced with iron to support tremendous weight. For the very first time in her difficult life, she did not feel too large for the room she occupied. Gideon gestured toward a wide, sturdy chair carved from solid pine. "Sit. The cold has seeped deep into your bones." Matilda lowered her formidable frame into the chair, anticipating the familiar creak of protesting wood. The chair remained silent and unyielding, holding her heavy, muscular weight with ease. Gideon moved about the kitchen with the quiet, efficient grace of a man accustomed to absolute solitude. He retrieved a heavy iron ladle and filled a deep clay bowl with thick chunks of tender beef, winter carrots, and rich dark broth. He placed the steaming bowl in front of her, followed by a thick slab of crusty sourdough bread. The portion was enormous. It was a meal fit for a towering frontier laborer. Matilda hesitated, her powerful hands resting on the edge of the table. In the wagon camp, her formidable appetite had been a constant source of cruel ridicule. The other women would whisper behind their hands, mocking the giant woman who ate like a starved ox. She'd learned to eat in shame, hiding her hunger to avoid their stinging words. She looked up through her tangled blonde hair, expecting to find Gideon staring at her with that same familiar mixture of amusement and disgust. Gideon was not looking at her at all. He was quietly filling his own bowl. He sat across from her, bowed his head in a brief, silent moment of gratitude, and began to eat. He offered no judgment. He demanded no conversation. He simply shared his sustenance with the quiet dignity of a man who understood the profound aches of a hard life. The rich hot stew flooded her empty stomach, thawing the frozen despair that had gripped her heart all evening. It was the most magnificent meal she had ever tasted. She ate with a fierce, starving urgency, tearing the thick bread with her strong hands and soaking up the savory broth. When she finally scraped the bottom of the deep bowl, a sudden flush of embarrassment heated her cheeks. She lowered her head, waiting for the inevitable reprimand regarding her unladylike behavior. Gideon simply reached across the heavy table and poured another generous ladle of hot stew into her bowl. The winter wind takes a heavy toll. Eat until the cold is completely gone. The deep timbre of his voice wrapped around her wounded spirit like a heavy, protective blanket. Matilda felt a sudden, unexpected stinging behind her eyes. Trust, a fragile and foreign emotion, began to take root in the deepest corners of her heart. She lifted her spoon again, but as her gaze drifted across the heavy oak table, she noticed something deeply unsettling. Set perfectly at the head of the table, sitting exactly between them, was a third-place setting. A pristine clay plate, a polished silver spoon, and a folded cloth napkin rested undisturbed in the flickering candlelight. There was no chair pulled up to that side of the table, nor was there any indication that another soul lived in this isolated valley. Matilda watched as Gideon lowered his heavy cup. His sharp eyes lingered on the empty plate for a long, agonizing moment. A shadow of profound, suffocating grief passed over his stoic face, a sorrow so immense it seemed to drain the very air from the room. He reached out with a calloused hand and gently adjusted the folded napkin, his thick fingers trembling with a hidden agony. Who did this empty plate belong to? And what devastating tragedy haunted the shadows of this lonely cowboy's heart? The first pale streaks of dawn bled across the harsh frontier sky, casting long, icy shadows through the frost-covered window panes of the isolated cabin. Matilda woke from the deepest, most undisturbed sleep she had experienced in months. She folded the thick woolen blankets with meticulous care. She possessed a fierce, unyielding pride. She would not accept charity. She would not be a burden. If she was to stay in this valley even for a few days, she would earn her place through the grueling labor she knew best. She splashed freezing water onto her resolute face, tied her long blonde hair back with a torn strip of cloth, and stepped out into the biting morning air. The sprawling ranch was locked in a bitter chill. The scent of pine needles and damp earth hung heavy in the wind. Near the rear of the large cattle barn, Gideon was already engaged in a brutal struggle. A massive oak support beam had fractured during a previous gale, threatening to collapse the entire rear roof. Gideon, a man of towering physical power, stood directly beneath the sagging timber. His thick arms trembled violently as he attempted to hoist the crushing weight of the splintered wood, while simultaneously kicking a thick structural brace into position. The heavy wood groaned in protest, inching downward. Sweat beaded on his sun-bronzed forehead despite the freezing temperature. He was losing the battle against the immense crushing gravity. Matilda did not hesitate. She did not wait for a polite invitation, nor did she offer a timid apology for intruding upon his labor. She crossed the frozen dirt yard with long, powerful strides, her heavy leather boots crunching against the ice. She positioned her formidable, towering frame directly beside him. She planted her thick boots wide into the frozen soil, securing a solid foundation. She slipped her broad, heavily muscled shoulders underneath the drooping end of the massive oak timber. She took a deep, grounding breath, filling her expansive chest with the sharp winter air. Then she pushed upward. The fabric of her faded red dress stretched tight against her swelling biceps and immense, powerful thighs. The tremendous raw power of her back engaged. The heavy timber creaked loudly, rising an inch, then two, lifted steadily toward the heavens by the astonishing physical might of the giant woman. She bore the agonizing weight with a fierce, beautiful dignity. "Slide the heavy brace," she grunted, the intense strain vibrating deeply through her chest. Gideon did not waste time indulging in foolish male pride. He swiftly maneuvered the thick wooden support into its designated notch, driving it home with a powerful strike of his boot. The crushing weight transferred safely from Matilda to the sturdy new pillar. The barn was secure. Matilda stepped back, her chest heaving heavily, brushing the coarse sawdust from her bare shoulders. She lowered her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable backlash. Throughout her difficult life, every time she demonstrated her overwhelming strength, Men responded with venom. They felt emasculated, humiliated, and threatened by a woman who could outwork them. She expected Gideon to scowl, to spit in the dirt, to demand she return to the kitchen where a woman belonged. Instead, she found him staring at her with complete, unmasked reverence. Gideon slowly removed his worn leather work gloves. The morning light caught the profound awe shining brightly in his sharp, observant eyes. He did not see a grotesque, imposing monster. He saw a magnificent, immensely capable, and deeply valuable woman. "I will not be a useless burden to you," Matilda murmured defensively, her voice trembling slightly as she misread his silence. "I will earn every piece of bread I consume." Gideon closed the distance between them, his towering presence offering an overwhelming sense of emotional safety. "You possess a rare and magnificent strength, Matilda," his voice rumbled gently, carrying a warmth that melted the frost around her guarded heart. "Do not ever feel the need to shrink yourself. Do not ever apologize for the tremendous gifts the Creator bestowed upon you. This ranch is blessed by your hands." A profound, quiet attachment firmly took root in Matilda's wounded spirit. For the first time in her existence, she felt truly seen. She felt validated. Her imposing size was not a shameful affliction in this isolated valley. It was a revered and respected asset. The heavy walls of her painful past began to crumble under the weight of his absolute honorable acceptance. But their tender moment of mutual respect suddenly shattered. The heavy atmospheric pressure plummeted with terrifying speed. The bright morning sun abruptly vanished, swallowed completely by an aggressive, boiling wall of black clouds rolling violently over the northern ridge. The wind shifted direction violently, carrying the biting, metallic scent of a freak valley blizzard. Gideon turned toward the sprawling, shadowed pasture, his eyes scanning the horizon. The stoic calm instantly evaporated from his weathered face, replaced by a sudden visceral terror. He gripped the rough wooden fence, his thick knuckles turning bone white. He realized something incredibly precious was missing from the huddled herd. What fragile life was this lonely cowboy about to risk his own survival to save in the teeth of the approaching deadly storm? The bitter wind shrieked through the valley, carrying the terrifying metallic scent of sudden death. Gideon vaulted over the heavy timber fence with a desperate, frantic agility. His wide eyes remained locked on the treacherous rocky ravine at the far edge of the frozen pasture. A frantic, high-pitched bleat pierced the howling gale. A newborn calf, separated from the frantic herd in the sudden chaos, had tumbled down the steep embankment and was trapped upon a narrow ledge of fragile ice. Gideon plunged into the freezing brush, but he was not alone. Matilda sprinted right behind him, her powerful, heavy legs eating up the treacherous distance. "The ice is completely unstable." Her deep voice fought against the roaring wind as she reached the edge of the chasm. "You cannot not lift the beast from that angle without falling." Gideon did not argue. He dropped to his stomach, reaching his thick arms down into the freezing abyss. Matilda immediately dropped beside him. She clamped her massive, heavily muscled hands onto his broad shoulders, acting as a living, unyielding anchor. As Gideon grasped the terrified calf, the ice beneath his chest gave way. Gravity sought to drag them both into the black depths, but Matilda roared against the storm. Her tremendous biceps bulged beneath her torn sleeves. She planted her heavy boots and hauled backward with astonishing force, pulling both the towering man and the trembling calf to safety just as the blinding whiteout struck. They fought their way back to the cabin, bursting through the heavy oak door. Gideon kicked the timber shut against the howling tempest. They collapsed onto the braided rug near the roaring hearth, gasping for air while the shivering calf curled into a pathetic, wet ball between them. Matilda moved quickly. She gathered thick woolen blankets, wrapping the fragile animal with surprising, tender grace. When she finally looked up, she found Gideon slumped against the heavy stone of the fireplace. He was not shivering from the freezing temperature. His massive sun-bronzed hands trembled violently. His breath hitched in his broad chest, and his hollow, haunted eyes were fixed upon the heavy oak table. He was staring directly at the pristine, empty clay plate. The fierce, protective cowboy looked entirely broken. Matilda abandoned the calf, crossing the room to kneel slowly beside his towering frame. She did not ask probing questions. She did not demand an explanation for his tears. She simply settled her imposing, muscular body close to his, offering her tremendous, steady presence as a physical shield against his unseen demons. She, a woman who had been continuously discarded and mocked by the world, now held the incredibly fragile heart of a profoundly strong man. His name was Samuel. The deep rumble of his voice cracked, laced with a decade of suffocating agony. He kept his eyes locked on the empty plate. He was my younger brother. He possessed a gentle, fragile spirit. 10 winters ago, a storm exactly like this one dropped upon the valley without warning. We were repairing the far fence line. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut. A single agonizing tear carved a path through the pale dust on his weathered cheek. I told him to hold my hand. I swore I would never let him go. But the wind was a roaring monster. It ripped him from my grasp. I searched for 2 days in the blinding white. When I finally found him, the snow had already claimed his life. I was supposed to be his protector, Matilda. I failed. The overwhelming weight of his tragic confession filled the small, warm room. Matilda finally understood the empty plate. It was a daily monument to a profound, unforgivable guilt. She reached out, resting her massive, calloused hand gently against his trembling jaw. The physical strength that terrified other men now offered profound, absolute comfort. "You are judging yourself for the wrath of the sky, Gideon," she murmured, her voice carrying the soothing rhythm of a gentle lullaby. "You cannot fight the heavens. You held on as long as humanly possible. Look at the fragile life you saved today." She gestured softly toward the sleeping calf. "Your hands bring life. Your heart is deeply good. Do not let the terrible storm continue to freeze your spirit." Gideon slowly leaned his heavy head into her massive, warm palm, closing his sharp eyes. He finally surrendered to the immense, suffocating grief he had carried entirely alone for 10 long years. In the quiet, glowing warmth of the isolated cabin, while the fierce blizzard raged furiously outside the thick timber walls, the towering giant of a woman became a flawless emotional fortress for the broken protector. The blinding storm howled relentlessly through the dark night, testing the strength of the heavy roof. Eventually, the roaring wind broke, fading away to reveal a silent, brilliantly sun-drenched morning. The harsh world outside the frost-covered window panes now sparkled with fresh, pristine snow, burying the scars of the rugged frontier. Absolute, undisturbed peace had seemingly settled upon the isolated valley. Then, a violent, aggressive pounding shattered the tranquility. Gideon rose, his expression instantly hardening into a mask of stoic authority. He pulled the heavy oak door open. Standing on the porch, flanked by 3 armed deputies, was the local sheriff. Behind them stood the cowardly wagon master, his face twisted in a venomous sneer of false triumph. The wagon master pointed a trembling finger directly at Matilda. "That giant beast stole a heavy lockbox of gold from my wagon before we left her behind. Arrest her." The sheriff placed a heavy hand upon his leather holster, stepping onto the threshold. Will Gideon surrender the very woman who just healed his deepest wounds over to the merciless law, or will he risk his absolute freedom to protect her from a wicked lie? Gideon did not flinch. He did not step backward. He filled the entire doorframe with his towering, imposing presence, effectively becoming an impenetrable fortress of flesh and bone. The sharp morning sunlight illuminated the hardened, stoic lines of his weathered face. He looked down upon the sheriff and the trembling wagon master with an expression of profound, quiet fury. The sheriff rested his hand heavily upon the worn leather of his gun belt. "Step aside, Gideon. I have a sworn statement regarding stolen property. I must place the giant woman in iron restraints. You will not step foot across my threshold." The deep, commanding rumble of Gideon echoed across the snow-covered porch. You will not draw that weapon, and you will certainly not place iron upon an innocent woman." Matilda stepped up behind him. Her massive, heavily muscled hands gently grasped his broad shoulder. She possessed the tremendous physical power to shatter the sheriff with a single blow, yet her heart was sick with fear for the honorable cowboy. She did not want Gideon to bleed for her. She prepared to surrender, to sacrifice her newfound freedom to preserve his peaceful life in the valley. Gideon reached up, placing his large, calloused hand over her thick fingers. He squeezed gently, halting her movement. "We will ride into town together," he commanded smoothly, keeping his piercing gaze locked entirely upon the sheriff. "She will ride beside me. She will not be dragged like a criminal. We will settle this matter in the public square, in the light of day." The journey into the small frontier settlement was agonizingly tense. The pristine, sparkling snow crunched loudly beneath the heavy hooves of their massive draft horses. Matilda rode tall, yet her spirit braced for absolute humiliation. She knew the townspeople would gather. She knew they would point at her overwhelming height, her towering frame, and the heavy muscles bulging beneath her winter coat. She had spent her entire existence being stared at as a grotesque anomaly. When they entered the muddy main street, her worst fears materialized. Shopkeepers abandoned their counters. Women pulled their children back onto the wooden boardwalks. The whispers rose into a harsh, cruel chorus. They stared at the giant woman with unabashed curiosity and judgment. But as Matilda looked over at Gideon, the crushing weight of their stares began to evaporate. He rode perfectly upright, completely unbothered by the murmuring crowd. He did not hide her. He did not ride ahead of her to distance himself from her intimidating presence. He rode precisely at her side, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering pride. For the very first time in her painful life, the profound public visibility did not feel like a punishment. It felt like an impenetrable shield. A profound sense of emotional safety bloomed wildly within her chest. They halted in the center of the town square. Gideon dismounted with fluid grace. He turned, offering his hand to Matilda. It was a gesture of immense respect, a public declaration that he viewed this giant, powerful woman as a lady worthy of deep honor. The wagon master stood safely behind the sheriff, his face twisted in a spiteful sneer. "Search her heavy satchel. You will find the gold she stole before we banished her." Gideon turned slowly. He walked toward the wagon master, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden boardwalk. He stopped mere inches from the cowardly man. "You abandoned a woman in the freezing wilderness. You left her with nothing but the clothes upon her back. Now you claim she carried a heavy iron lockbox of gold across 10 miles of open prairie on foot?" The sheriff frowned, looking toward the wagon master. The logistical impossibility of the accusation hung heavily in the cold morning air. "Check his own supply cart," Gideon demanded, his voice slicing through the silent square like a sharpened blade. "A coward who lies about leaving a woman to die will certainly lie about misplacing his own gold to avoid the anger of his crew." Two deputies immediately moved toward the heavy wagons parked near the livery. Within moments, a shout confirmed the truth. The missing lockbox was buried securely beneath a pile of grain sacks, exactly where the foolish wagon master had hidden it for safekeeping and promptly forgotten it. The town square fell deathly silent. The false accusation was entirely shattered. Gideon turned to face the entire gathered crowd. He placed himself directly in front of Matilda. "This woman is under my absolute protection. She works my ranch. She shares my table. Anyone who raises a hand, a weapon, or a false word against her will answer directly to me." Matilda felt her breath catch violently in her throat. Her powerful, muscular legs trembled. She was claimed. She was protected. She was finally safe. But the wagon master, humiliated and desperate, completely lost his mind. He spat violently into the muddy snow. "You think you are protecting a decent woman, foreman?" he screamed, his face purple with venomous rage. "Do you know why she is truly alone? Ask her about the scars upon her back. Ask her why her own parents sold her to a traveling beast show when she was merely 10 years old. Her own blood cast her out because she is a monster. You are sheltering a freak of nature that not even a mother could love." The cruel, devastating secret echoed off the wooden buildings. Matilda felt the world violently collapse beneath her heavy boots. How will this shameful, agonizing revelation alter the honorable perception of the stoic cowboy? The venomous words of the wagon master hung in the freezing air, striking the fragile heart of Matilda with the force of a physical blow. The horrific secret she had buried beneath years of silent toil was now exposed to the harsh daylight. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for Gideon to finally step away in disgust. Surely no honorable man would shelter a woman entirely discarded by her own flesh and blood, a woman once paraded as a grotesque beast for the amusement of cruel strangers. Gideon did not step away. He slowly turned his massive frame toward the trembling wagon master. The absolute silence in the town square shattered as Gideon closed the distance in 2 tremendous strides. He reached out with one heavily muscled arm, gripping the thick wool coat of the smaller man. With terrifying ease, Gideon lifted the cowardly wagon master completely off the wooden boardwalk, holding him suspended in the air. "Her past is a testament to her magnificent survival," Gideon rumbled, his voice dark and lethal. "If I ever hear you speak of her with anything less than absolute respect, there is no corner of this frontier where you will find safe harbor. Leave this territory." He dropped the trembling man into the freezing mud. Gideon turned back to Matilda, his expression softening instantly. He offered his large hand once more, guiding her gently toward their waiting horses. The ride back to the isolated valley passed in complete silence, but the heavy shadow of the cruel revelation entirely swallowed the spirit of Matilda. Midnight blanketed the frozen ranch in suffocating darkness. Inside the quiet cabin, Matilda stood beside her small, woven satchel. She folded her meager belongings with trembling hands. The glowing embers in the massive stone hearth cast long, dancing shadows across her towering, muscular frame. She had finally found a profound emotional safety, a man who offered her a seat at his table and protected her dignity in the public square. But the venomous truth remained. Her deeply scarred past would only drag his honorable reputation into the mud. She could not repay his profound kindness by tarnishing his righteous name. She firmly believed she was destined to carry the heavy weight of her isolation entirely alone. She hoisted the heavy satchel over her broad shoulders, leaving a silent, grateful prayer near the empty third plate upon the oak table. She slipped through the heavy timber door, stepping out into the biting winter wind. She reached the heavy wooden gate at the edge of the property. The freezing latch was covered in frost. As she reached forward, a massive shadow detached itself from the line of towering pines. Gideon stood squarely blocking the path. He wore no heavy coat, braving the freezing temperature in only a thick flannel shirt. His broad chest heaved heavily in the dark. He had anticipated her flight. He recognized the terrifying fear of rejection completely consuming her wounded spirit. "The night is far too cold for traveling." His deep voice cut through the whistling wind, carrying a profound, desperate urgency. Matilda planted her heavy leather boots into the snow, looking down at the frozen ground. "You heard the truth today. My own mother and father looked at my tremendous size and saw only a monster to be sold. I carry ugly, heavy scars across my back from the iron chains of a traveling spectacle. I am not a proper woman, Gideon. I am a wild, broken thing. Your honorable name will suffer deeply if I remain." Gideon closed the distance between them. He did not care about the freezing wind. He reached out, placing his massive, calloused hands gently upon her broad, heavily muscled shoulders. "I do not care about the blind ignorance of your parents," Gideon commanded softly, his sharp eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "I do not care about the cruel chains of your past. Those heavy scars do not make you a monster. They prove that the wicked world tried to break your beautiful spirit, and it entirely failed. You are not a burden. You are the exact piece this broken valley desperately needed. Do not punish me by walking away." A profound, shattering sob tore through the broad chest of Matilda. The heavy armor of her painful past finally collapsed entirely. She leaned her towering frame forward, burying her tear-stained face into the solid, warm chest of the lonely cowboy. He wrapped his thick, powerful arms around her, pulling her close, holding her massive weight as if she were the most precious treasure upon the earth. The agonizing fear of loss instantly transformed into a deep, reluctant acceptance of his complete devotion. The following afternoon brought a bright, deceiving peace. They worked together along the southern pasture, replacing heavy timber posts damaged by the recent blizzard. The steady rhythm of their shared labor felt like a quiet, beautiful song. Matilda carried the massive wooden logs upon her broad shoulders, while Gideon secured the deep trenches. Without warning, the frozen earth trembled violently. A massive rogue steer, maddened by the lingering winter chill and a deep predator wound upon its flank, broke violently from the brush. It charged with terrifying, blind fury directly at the fence line. Gideon turned, raising his heavy iron shovel to deflect the beast, but the impact was devastating. The tremendous weight of the maddened animal shattered the new timber post, violently pinning the towering cowboy beneath the heavy wood and the thrashing horned beast. The sickening crack of bone echoed across the frozen pasture. Gideon gasped in sudden agony, completely trapped beneath the crushing force. The enraged steer thrashed wildly, preparing to drive its heavy hooves down upon his unprotected chest. The distance was agonizingly vast. Can the giant woman cross the treacherous icy ground fast enough to save the only man who ever truly loved her, or will she arrive entirely too late? Matilda did not freeze. She did not scream. A primal, earth-shattering roar erupted from the deepest depths of her expansive chest. Her heavy leather boots tore through the frozen pasture, launching clumps of ice and snow into the bitter wind. She crossed the treacherous distance with terrifying speed. The enraged steer lowered its heavy horned head, preparing to crush the fallen cowboy completely. Matilda threw her towering, fiercely muscular body directly between the maddened beast and the broken man. She planted her thick boots deeply into the frozen mud. She slammed her broad shoulders heavily against the thick flank of the thrashing steer. The tremendous impact echoed across the silent valley. She gripped the heavy, sharp horns with her massive, calloused hands. Her enormous biceps swelled beneath her torn sleeves. She twisted her powerful torso with astonishing raw fury, throwing the massive animal entirely off balance. The beast stumbled, terrified by a physical force greater than its own wild nature, and fled blindly into the dense timberline. Matilda dropped to her knees beside Gideon. Dark blood stained the pristine snow. His massive leg was trapped beneath the shattered oak beam, twisted at a horrifying angle. His eyes were squeezed tightly shut against the blinding agony. "Do not move," she commanded fiercely, her deep voice trembling with sudden agonizing terror. She slid her thick fingers under the crushing oak timber. She braced her powerful thighs and lifted the tremendous weight, tossing the heavy beam aside as if it were a fragile winter branch. Gideon groaned deeply, his stoic facade finally breaking under the tremendous pain. He could not walk. He could not even stand. The distance back to the isolated cabin was immense, and the sky was rapidly darkening with the approaching night. "Leave me," Gideon rasped, his breath turning to white vapor in the freezing air. "The cold will freeze the blood. Go warm the hearth and save yourself." Matilda completely ignored his foolish pride. She possessed the extraordinary physical strength that the cruel world had mocked her entire life. Now, that exact strength would become the ultimate salvation for the only man who truly mattered. She knelt intimately beside his broken form. She slipped one heavily muscled arm securely under his broad shoulders and the other directly behind his thick knees. With a deep, powerful breath, she stood upright. She lifted the towering, massive cowboy entirely into her arms. The grueling journey back to the cabin was a brutal test of absolute human endurance. The freezing wind whipped mercilessly against her resolute face. Her heavy muscles burned with agonizing fire. Yet she held his heavy frame securely against her expansive chest, wrapping him entirely in her profound physical warmth. She walked with a steady, unyielding rhythm, refusing to let his heavy burden slip a single inch. When she finally kicked the heavy oak door open, the glowing embers in the hearth provided a small, desperate sanctuary against the wild frontier. She laid his towering body gently upon the thick mattress in the corner of the room. Her massive, calloused hands moved with astonishing tender grace as she worked furiously to save him. She cut away the heavy, blood-soaked denim of his trousers. She set the broken bone with swift, brutal precision, ignoring his sharp cry of pain, and bound his shattered leg tightly with splints of split wood. She washed the dirt and blood from his pale forehead using a soft cloth and warm water, treating his broken form with deep, profound reverence. Midnight completely swallowed the valley. A violent fever took tight hold of Gideon. The deep pain stripped away his quiet, stoic armor. He thrashed weakly beneath the heavy woolen blankets, caught in a terrifying haze of delirium and agony. Matilda sat firmly upon the edge of the mattress. She placed her massive hand gently against his burning chest, offering a steady physical anchor to reality in the dark room. Gideon slowly opened his glazed, bloodshot eyes. He looked up at her tired, resolute face illuminated by the flickering hearth. His heavy hand reached up, weakly grasping her thick fingers. "They called you a monster," he breathed softly, his deep voice thick with fever and profound emotion. "They are blind fools. You are the most beautiful creature God ever placed upon the earth." Matilda felt a sharp, heavy lump form deep in her throat. She gently stroked his sweat-drenched hair. "Rest your mind, Gideon. The fever speaks for you." "My heart speaks," he murmured fiercely, his grip tightening with surprising strength. "I watched you walk away last night. It felt like the sun disappeared entirely from the sky. I do not want the empty plate anymore, Matilda. I only want you. I want your heavy boots resting by my door. I want your quiet strength holding my fragile life together forever. Do not leave me." The raw, unguarded confession struck her wounded soul like a heavy, magnificent dawn. For the first time in her painful life, a man did not desire her strength for cheap labor. He desired her immense towering spirit for absolute, unwavering love. She bowed her heavy head, allowing silent tears to fall freely upon his calloused knuckles. She sat there, a silent guardian, watching his broad chest rise and fall as the deep sleep of exhaustion finally claimed his broken body. The heavy silence of the isolated cabin wrapped around them, suspended in absolute peace. The following evening, the dangerous fever finally broke. Gideon opened his eyes slowly, the sharp pain in his leg grounding him firmly in reality. The cabin was warm. The hearth was glowing brightly, but as he turned his heavy head toward the bedside, a chilling dread instantly paralyzed his newly mended heart. The wooden chair beside his bed was entirely empty. The small woven satchel was completely gone from the corner of the room. Did his desperate, delirious confession of deep love frighten the wild, guarded woman away forever? Gideon's heart hammered violently against his ribs. The crushing silence of the cabin felt entirely suffocating. He threw the heavy woolen blankets aside, ignoring the sharp, agonizing flare of pain shooting up his splinted leg. He refused to let the giant woman vanish into the freezing wild. He gripped the rough timber of the bed frame, pulling his towering, heavy body upright. He found a sturdy wooden staff resting near the nightstand, a silent, physical testament to her care before she allegedly departed. He leaned heavily upon the makeshift crutch, dragging his broken leg across the braided rug. The cold floorboards creaked beneath his immense weight. He reached the heavy oak door, throwing the iron latch with frantic, trembling hands. The freezing evening air rushed inside as the heavy door swung entirely open. He stopped completely. His broad chest heaved with overwhelming, profound relief. Matilda had not abandoned him. She stood at the edge of the snowy porch, her towering, wildly muscular frame silhouetted against the vibrant, burning sunset. She held a heavy iron axe in her massive hands, splitting thick logs of winter pine with astonishing rhythmic power. Her small woven satchel sat near the steps, packed and ready, but entirely covered in a fresh layer of evening frost. She had tried to leave to protect his honorable name, but her fiercely devoted heart had absolutely refused to let her walk away. Gideon leaned against the heavy doorframe. "You pack a terribly slow bag for a woman attempting to run away from a helpless cripple." Matilda froze. The heavy iron axe dropped into the deep snow. She turned her resolute face toward the warm cabin. Her long, tangled blonde hair caught the golden light of the fading sun. The deep, agonizing fear of rejection still haunted her soft, feminine eyes, but the undeniable relief of seeing him standing upright overpowered her lingering insecurities. She crossed the frozen yard in 3 massive strides, dropping to her knees upon the wooden porch to examine his freshly splinted leg. "You foolish, stubborn man," she breathed softly, her tremendous hands hovering over his bandages with profound gentleness. "You will destroy the bone entirely. You belong securely in the bed." Gideon reached down slowly. He placed his massive, calloused hands gently upon her broad, heavily muscled cheeks, lifting her face until her eyes met his. "I belong exactly where you are," his deep voice rumbled with absolute, unwavering certainty. "You stayed. You packed your heavy satchel, you walked to the frozen edge of the property, but you stayed with me." A single heavy tear carved a path down the sun-bronzed cheek of the giant woman. "I cannot cure your reputation in the town, Gideon. I cannot erase the ugly, cruel scars upon my back. I am entirely too large for a normal, quiet life." "I do not want a normal life," Gideon commanded softly, his sharp eyes burning with a fierce, protective devotion. "I want a magnificent life. I want a woman possessing the tremendous strength to carry my broken body out of the freezing wild. I want a woman who builds an impenetrable fortress around my fragile, grieving heart. Do not ever attempt to shrink yourself again, Matilda. You're exactly the perfect size for this vast, empty valley. You are the exact, brilliant equal to my spirit. But the cruel world will always stare," she whispered, the deep vulnerability vibrating through her broad chest. "They will point at my heavy shoulders. They will whisper about the beast you harbor in your home." "Let them stare blindly," Gideon replied fiercely, his rough thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "They stare because they are weak, and they do not understand the sheer, breathtaking beauty of a woman who completely refuses to break. I will stand proudly beside you in every public square across this untamed frontier. I will claim you proudly before the heavens and every living soul. You are my profound honor, Matilda." The heavy, suffocating walls of her painful past completely shattered upon the frozen wooden porch. The cruel voices of the cowardly wagon train, the wicked whispers of the town, and the blind rejection of her parents faded into absolute nothingness. Matilda wrapped her massive, incredibly powerful arms around his thick waist, burying her face against his broad chest. For the very first time in her lonely, difficult existence, she finally believed she was profoundly lovable. Gideon leaned heavily upon her towering frame, allowing her immense physical strength to guide him safely back inside the warm cabin. The deep purple twilight descended upon the isolated frontier, but the biting cold no longer held any power over their entwined souls. It was Sunday evening. The rich aroma of roasted meat and simmering winter vegetables filled the heavy timber walls, just as it had upon the very first night she arrived. Matilda moved gracefully around the warm kitchen, her imposing size finally completely at peace within the large, sturdy space. She set the heavy oak table. Gideon limped slowly toward the wooden cupboard. He reached out with a steady, resolute hand. He lifted the pristine third clay plate, the fragile monument to his terrible grief, and stared at it for a long, quiet moment. He did not feel the agonizing, suffocating sorrow anymore. He only felt profound, absolute peace. He gently wrapped the plate in the folded cloth napkin, honoring the precious memory of his fallen brother, and placed it securely upon the highest shelf. He closed the heavy wooden door softly. He returned to the heavy table. There were only 2 plates set. He sat directly across from the magnificent, giant woman. They bowed their heads in a silent, profound moment of gratitude. The bitter dust of abandonment was completely washed away, replaced forever by the unbreakable warmth of a beautiful, shared future. There's a peculiar kind of magic hidden deep within the rugged corners of this untamed frontier. It is not the fragile magic of easy lives or gentle winds. It is the profound magic of two broken, jagged souls perfectly fitting together to create an impenetrable fortress against the harsh world. Matilda spent her entire existence believing she was entirely too large, too wild, and too deeply scarred to be worthy of a tender heart. She allowed the cowardly judgments of weak men to dictate her immense value. But true love does not ask us to shrink into the shadows. True love demands that we stand tall in all our powerful, unapologetic glory. Gideon carried the heavy, suffocating ghost of his tragic past for a decade, convinced he was unworthy of forgiveness or joy. Yet when the violent storm of life brought a magnificent giant to his doorstep, he did not turn her away in fear. He looked past the heavy muscles and the torn, faded dresses, seeing only the beautiful, fragile spirit desperate for a safe harbor. We all carry invisible scars. We all have dark moments when we feel too strange, too burdened, or too deeply broken to sit at the table of happiness. But perhaps the exact things we hate most about ourselves are the very tools the Creator designed to save the person we are truly destined to love. If you ever find yourself abandoned upon a lonely, dusty trail, remember the giant woman and the stoic cowboy. Keep walking. Do not hide your magnificent strength. Somewhere in the deep valleys of this massive world, a quiet, devoted heart is keeping an extra plate warm just for you. Thank you for sharing this campfire with me. May your own journey lead you to a table where you are deeply loved, entirely exactly as you are. The story presented above is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The themes explored, including overcoming prejudice, emotional healing, and resilience, are intended for mature emotional reflection within a family-safe PG context. This narrative respects YouTube Partner Program, YPP guidelines, and contains no graphic violence, gore, or inappropriate content.